Thank you very much. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our first keynote of the summit. Gloria Steinem is a writer, political activist, and feminist organizer. Based in New York City, Gloria co-founded the groundbreaking Ms. Magazine in 1972. And I want to say to her, who's standing off to the side here, that my staff, after I became a leader in 1975, were very active readers of that publication. And she has just published her best-selling My Life on the Road. Her other books include Revolution from Within, a book of self-esteem, Outrageous Acts and Everyday Rebellions, and Moving Beyond Words. 3 years ago, Ms. Steinem received from President Obama the Presidential Medal of Freedom. This is the United States' highest civilian honor. One of the things that strikes you about Gloria is just how multifaceted her activism is. She's not only a gifted writer, but also, in plain language, a kind of boots-on-the-ground organizer. She's also an accomplished public speaker who tours relentlessly, not only across the United States, but also around the world. And dear to our hearts here at the Broadbent Institute, she has always connected her advocacy directly to the political process. Her work has helped define the modern feminist struggle for nearly 50 years. One of Gloria's many, and there are many, I urge you to read her most recent book. It has a marvelous chapter I mentioned to her a minute ago on conversations with cab drivers. It's absolutely superb. One of her many inspiring quotations bears emphasizing in this context. In a speech to the National Press Club in the U.S. a few years ago, she said, and I quote, "You know, people often ask me at this age, who am I passing the torch on to? And I always say, first of all, that I'm not giving up my torch." Thank you very much. And she went on to say, "I'm using my torch to light the torches of others. If we each have a torch, there's a lot more light." End of quote. Well, get your torches ready. Ladies and gentlemen, Gloria Steinem. Yeah.
Thank you so much for inviting me to join this group of good hearts and great minds and progressive hopes. In other words, a Trump-free zone. Don't worry, we're not going to elect him. You're not going to be faced with, doubling your population because we all flee here. And I'm so pleased to be here also with Desmond Cole, who's writing an activism I admire, and with my dear friend Michele Landsberg, who has taught me everything I know today. I hope she's satisfied. And especially because I have also just come from a long effort to organize what you might say is a Broadbent Institute, which is a school for organizers that Wilma Mankiller, the chief of the Cherokee Nation, and I was our dream, and we are actually beginning to do that. I think we are so, all of us, aligned in our efforts to support new leadership, whatever the age new leadership may be, to be aware of newly emerging rights and issues, and to make connections among all of them, to keep the spider web. I think that we have long been kind of cursed with a more European idea of hierarchy, when in fact, had we kept the model of organizing that was here before Europeans showed up, we would have understood that it was a circle, that the paradigm of life is not a pyramid like this, but it is, in fact, a circle. And that what we struggle for is to understand that we are, as human beings, linked, not ranked. And we are linked to the environment. It is an entire paradigm shift, and it is not easy, but I think once we have it in our minds, we can never, never, never unremember it. It is beginning, I think, with our own movements that we need to make these connections, because our movements grew up in silos. To speak about our own history in the States, we grew up with the civil rights movement, with the environmental movement, with the women's movement, with the gay and lesbian and transgender movements, and it is probably very important and maybe inevitable that each invisible group and issue rises up in that way, so that we must make the invisible visible and name ourselves and name the problems and name the legal remedies we need for the problems and the changes in consciousness we need for the problems. But at a certain point, we must understand that we are all connected and that all the movements are interdependent. And I believe that is the stage that we are in right now. We are beginning to see those connections. The truth of the matter is that they were always, always there. The women's movement has always been primarily necessitated by various kinds of male-dominant systems that set out to control reproduction, and that meant controlling the bodies of women. And it always meant that if there was a system of caste or race or class in addition, then it redoubled the necessity of controlling reproduction. If you look at the history of India, for instance, it's clear that there were matrilineal cultures in the South before the more fair-skinned groups came over the Himalayas and gradually imposed the caste system. And the caste system necessitated the control of reproduction. In order to keep a particular visible difference in the long term, you have to control reproduction. So caste and sex were always intertwined there, and they've always been intertwined on our continent as well. It has ever been true that if there was racism, it was not possible to maintain without sexism, without controlling women and controlling reproduction and deciding who had children with what group. It is crucial that we see that intertwining, because we sometimes now present our movements as if they were ever separate, as if it was ever possible to be a feminist without being anti-racist. It's never been possible. And as if the most tragic part of this to me is that we have not recognized, speaking for my own country, we have not recognized that women of color, and black women especially, have been always in the leadership of the women's movement. And in my own personal experience, it's where I learned feminism. It was from black women in the United States that I learned feminism. And that is something of an accident, depending on where we are. I understand that was not everyone's experience, because we do live still in a racially segregated society. But I remember that in one of the very first issues of Ms. Magazine, we did the first national poll of women's opinions on women's issues. It was a big, respectable Lou Harris poll, and it turned out that African American women, black women, supported the issues of the movement and the movement itself by 60%, and white women only by 30%. And yet, we still hear that the movement is supposedly in its roots or characterization a white middle-class movement. It has never, ever, ever been the case. And when we say that, we render many of the women who pioneered feminism invisible. I hope that we are beginning to see the origins in our own movements and see the connections in our own movements. But I also think now we need to, well, and yes, I have to say, when I'm on campus sometimes, they will say to me, why is it that the same groups are against lesbians and birth control? This seems to them irrational. So, but we have to understand that actually the same impulse to control reproduction and direct all sexuality into reproduction then meant that, of course, any sexuality that didn't end in reproduction was wrong and immoral. So any love between two men or between two women, any contraception, any acknowledgement of the fact that human sexuality has always been a way we reach out to each other and express love and caring and pleasure, not only a means of reproduction. I mean, all of our monotheisms have basically been lying to us about reproduction, about human sexuality, that it has always been, in fact, the contrary of human expression, and yet somehow it is still with us. I'm glad to see that you have just had another victory announced this morning for safe and legal abortion and for control. And together we are moving towards the place where we will understand that reproductive freedom is a fundamental human right, like freedom of speech, like freedom of assembly, that the ability to control our bodies, women and men, from the skin in is fundamental. Perhaps we are moving towards another fundamental way of stating this right, and I'm not sure what it will be called. I think of it as bodily integrity. The power of the state stops at our skins. We have, whether we are men or women, we have the power to make the decisions about ourselves, about our physical selves. But we are, in our legal system, still not there yet. So I think as we move towards this goal of understanding we are linked, not ranked, we are also understanding that our issues are linked. And this still is not really reflected in the way we, at least at a media level, talk about our issues. For instance, we have been talking for quite a while about economic stimulus, right? All kinds of discussion of economic stimulus. It is very rare, and in our media in the States, I haven't seen it yet, to talk about equal pay as an economic stimulus. For women of all races and ethnicities and groups to be paid the same as a white guy who's doing the same job or a comparable job would be the biggest economic stimulus we could possibly have. In the States, it would put $200 billion more every year into the economy. And those women are not going to put that money in a Swiss bank account. No. They are going to spend it. And also, single-parent households, female-headed households, are those most likely to be poor. And the kids are most likely to need social services, so equal pay would diminish the need for social services. It is a win-win. But so far, we have truly not had this kind of discussion. Or take another instance. We talk about domestic violence, and I'm very proud that we have the phrase, that we have made the invisible visible, that we have changed in both of our countries' laws and processes and procedures, established shelters and so on. But we have not really recognized that domestic violence is linked to pretty much all other violence. That if you experience violence as a child in your household, it normalizes it, or at a minimum makes you feel that it is inevitable. And therefore, we don't use it as an indicator of violence to come. For instance, I think as a particular case in Florida of Zimmerman, the man who murdered Trayvon Martin, right? All right, Zimmerman had been violent to women in his life, well-documented violence, but this was not mitigated or changed. And not only that, but this violence and convictions of this violence was not even admitted in the trial of his trial for murdering Trayvon Martin. It's possible that if we had understood that domestic violence normalizes and is linked to violence outside the home, Trayvon Martin might still be alive. What about our police forces mutually? I mean, again, speaking for my country, I have yet to find a police force that screens for domestic violence. Not to keep everyone out who's had an incident of domestic violence, but to be conscious of it, to try to change it, to reform it. And it is directly related to racist violence by cops outside the home, because they are both supremacy crimes. They are crimes, domestic violence, racist crime, they are crimes in which there is no monetary gain, often after domestic violence incidents or people who go into public places and kill indiscriminately, the criminal will kill himself. It is not about gain. It is what I think of as a supremacy crime. It is only about proving supremacy. And that criminal did not invent the idea of having to be superior. It is the idea of masculinity gone mad. He grew up with the conviction that he had to be in control in order to be masculine. And if we made that connection, we could benefit everyone. And now we are beginning to realize how much we need to do this in our foreign policy as well. For instance, there is a book I recommend to you called Sex and World Peace by Valerie Hudson and many other scholars, a very scholarly book, but readable, which surveys pretty much every current country and proves beyond a doubt that the single most important indicator of whether that country will be violent inside itself, in its own streets, or will be willing to use military violence against another country, is actually not poverty, not access to natural resources, not religion, or even degree of democracy. It's violence against females. Not because female life is any more precious than male life, no, but because the initial compulsion to control reproduction means that the gender roles, we invented them, we can disinvent them, right? The invented gender roles of superior masculine and inferior feminine are all about controlling reproduction. They tend to be what we see first in our lives growing up. They are at least about control, frequently about violence, and that means they're normalizing all other instances of control and violence. I mean, in our police forces, the families of police officers have 2 or 3 times the incidence of domestic violence as in the population at large. But we are not, as far as I could be able to determine, we are not screening for that or discussing that or making that kind of connection. So what we need to make these linkages not only among ourselves, not only to understand that we are linked, we are not ranked, but also among our movements and our issues. I'm very proud of our Black Lives Matter movement and very And as you know, the women's movement came in part out of the movements we loved, our peace movement, our civil rights movement, and the fact that women in those movements were not necessarily equal all the time. So that was part of the reason for the understanding there needed to be an autonomous movement. So I just want to make sure that you know that 3 young Black women were the founders of this big, now decentralized, huge movement. And their names are Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi. And I want to leave you with their 3 great rules for organizing. Lead with love. 1, 2, low ego, high impact. 3, move at the speed of trust. Is that not great? Thank you.
Good morning. Can everybody hear me? Okay, there we go. Thank you very much, Gloria, and welcome back to Canada. I got in late last evening, and I was watching television as I was settling into my hotel room, and I saw you being interviewed by Shad of CBC's Q. And
I hate to think what I was saying. I don't remember what I was saying.
It was a great interview, but I was thinking about coming up here on stage with you this morning, and I don't know how often you come to our country, but I was thinking Gloria Steinem's going to think that all of the journalists in Canada now are these like handsome, enlightened Black men.
Well, maybe that explains why I've been here 3 times in the last.
So I just wanted to clarify that the revolution is coming, but it hasn't quite happened yet. This is a rare experience that you keep having with these interviews. It is an honor to get to speak with you this morning, and I wanted to ask you to begin, because I am a writer. You know, I love journalism as a whole, but writing is the thing that I love the most. And I've reflected that it was something that I did even before I was really conscious of it. I used to scribble in little journals as a child. And I wonder, when did you first start writing just for yourself?
Well, I think first I started reading. I was just in love with books, and my idea of reading was that I started it and I finished it at the same time, so I would stay up all night. I used to hear myself describing what I was doing. You know, she gets up, she goes, I don't know why. It doesn't make sense. But they were my escape from everything, books. And I didn't go to school very much till I was about 11, so I was constantly reading. And I just didn't think it was possible. I didn't know anybody who actually, especially not women, but really I didn't know anybody who made a living writing. So it took me a while, but I was greatly aided too in becoming a writer by a father who had 2 points of pride. He never had a job, by which he meant he never worked for anybody else, right? He never wore a hat. He was supremely independent, right? So this has enabled me to live with what you may have to live with too, which is a very uneven income.
Don't get me started. By the way, for all of you out there, you guys have been explained how to use the app to ask questions, right? Oh my goodness gracious. Well, you can do so. And I see some of you are saying yes. But you can submit your questions now. And as we speak, I'm going to be taking some questions from folks on the floor as well. Yeah, you talk, Gloria, about the uneven life of being a journalist sometimes. And you've been a journalist and an activist and been unapologetic about the apparent conflict that a lot of people see between those two things. Did you ever have instances in your career where people pushed back at you and said that you can't do these things simultaneously?
Well, I wasn't a reporter for a newspaper. So, I was always writing magazine articles, so that diminishes the idea of it. But I think, we do have an absolute obligation to present as facts, true facts. If we're saying it's a fact, we have to do our best to make sure that it really is. But as long as we label our opinion, then as such, I think it's okay. And also, it dawned on me from reading the history of journalism that before the telegraph machine, the journalists of the day, Winston Churchill even as a young journalist in Africa, used literary forms, the essay. The whole idea was to put the reader in the position where the writer was and give them the same experience. And it was only the invention of the telegraph machine that gave us this supposedly sacred who, what, where, why, when notion, the inverted pyramid, that you should be able to cut it off from the bottom. It was a function of the telegraph machine and of using telegraph operators as writers. So now that we again have simultaneous transmission because of the miracle of technology, the journalism schools are still teaching who, what, where, whatever, the inverted, we don't need to do that anymore. So it seems to me there should not be a conflict as long as we are super careful about the facts we present and super careful to, present our own impressions as what they really are. I do wish we had a big fact checker in the sky, I have to say, for the internet. And the reason that the brand names from old journalism continue is because you do have some faith in the reliability of the facts. So, we have to bridge that distance, I think, somehow.
I want to read a quote from your latest book, My Life on the Road. And you said that in the same way that individual women are often underestimated, a movement of women is also underestimated. And I wonder who you see doing great work in your country or abroad right now that you think is not getting the attention or the recognition or the support that they need or deserve.
Well, here's my current example is that
there is a big movement in what we call the pink-collar ghetto, that is, the jobs that are like 70% female. Disproportionately women of color usually, and 70-80% female. They're the healthcare jobs, they're the home care jobs, and there is a organizing effort now going forward among them. Household workers, for instance, domestic workers. iGenPoo is a wonderful AI-JENPO, because I want you to Google her and see how terrific she is. And nurses. I mean, I think I've marched with more nurses than any other occupational group.
My mom is actually a nurse. Both of my parents are nurses, and my mom is still practicing as a nurse today.
Well, you know, so... I think that we don't see that, right? We don't see it as a massive movement that is really responsible for paid sick days, which we are now getting city by city. We don't necessarily have our state legislatures, but we have our cities, so we're doing it that way, passing this, sometimes a job protective movement. And so it seems to me that we understood the bread, but we forgot the roses, if you know what I mean. And now when I see these huge areas of female employment organizing, and in a very different way, you know, in a very inclusive way. I mean, the household workers movement is organizing employers who also want to be fair, and so, you know, they're not just setting up an antagonism between the employee and the employer when it isn't necessary. Sometimes it's necessary, but, you know, not when it isn't. So I think we might be seeing, even though it's not being reported very much, a big union organizing movement, something like the 30s, right?
Someone in the audience has asked me to ask you to elaborate on your dream of an organizing school. So what does the Gloria Steinem School for Butt Kicking look like exactly?
We're nice to some butts and kick others is better.
Well, I feel like you've been quoted as saying, or maybe it was somebody that you were reflecting on saying, that the good part about getting your butt kicked is that your ass remains soft.
No, this is really important. Thank you for saying that. Because
just the facts, right?
This comes from the great Florence Kennedy, my speaking partner of many years. I hope some of you knew or remember Flo Kennedy, an outrageously wonderful woman. And, you know, every once in a while, I and all of us, but I'm speaking for myself, definitely I fuck up in public. And and then, you know, you feel misunderstood, you feel in despair, you know, because it isn't what you meant to say, it's what you were interpreted as saying. It just happened to me on a late night comedy show. In the middle of a sentence, they cut me off. It was terrible. Anyway, so I always remember Flo saying that the point of kicking ass is not that you get your ass kicked at the right time for the right thing, but that it keeps your ass sensitive. A great comfort.
So I imagine that would be a lesson in the Gloria Steinem School.
Yes, it would be. Well, when Wilma Mankiller and I were talking about this, it really started to happen because we saw so many gifted organizers, like, you know, and with no place to go, unless we sent them to Canada, of course, and sent them to Ukraine. So we began to think about it, and the first thing we said to each other is it can't be on a campus, because we didn't want it to be academic and so on. But then we discovered that Smith College happens to have the biggest archive in the world of women's groups, not just Planned Parenthood and big groups, but also small neighborhood groups. So we switched it to there, although you know, it's still absolutely crucial that the people will be able to go out to actual groups of their interest and be with those groups. But I just came from Smith, and things are happening I didn't even think of. There's a course on household work historically over time, and the young women in the course are using the archives to research the past and are using it to help household workers organizing in Boston, in Massachusetts. So the students are responsible not only to their own grades and their professor, but to those workers in Boston, you know, that's helping in the present. And that was something that neither Wilma and I had thought of. So we thought of it as training individual organizers, but I think with luck it will change, it will make a link between academia and activism.
Now, I know that everywhere you go, you get questions about the ongoing presidential primaries, and there's a name that's always coming up over and over again. And I don't necessarily want to talk about that individual per se, but about a question that was asked about Donald Trump to Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. And in a very point-blank way that I have not seen before, at a debate recently, both Sanders and Clinton were asked, do you believe Donald Trump is a racist? Neither one of them said yes. I have my own personal feelings about and I will be in the lobby later to discuss them. And over drinks this evening, as Mr. Broadbent was talking about. But I honestly want to know what you think about, in 2016, with the overt racism that this man exhibits. Why? Why the shyness in his opponents politically of saying, of course, he's a racist?
Well, I'm not running for office, so I'm happy to say he's a racist. So. And I'd like to say something else, because when people are asked why they are for him in public opinion polls, they say it's because he's a successful businessman. So I would like to say he is not a successful businessman. He is a successful con man. Somebody intelligently figured out that if he had simply invested at market rate the $200 million he inherited from his father, he'd be richer than now. Because he has gone bankrupt several times, stuck other people with his debt. He is not a successful businessman. He is a con man. And he is a protest candidate. Now, it's also true that I am a hopeaholic, okay? So I'll say the only cheerful thing I've been able to think of so far while watching him on television, incidentally, you know, that he rates women as no longer being a 10 when he's never been a 1, you know? It's, you know, that he comments on women's bodies and says he's, you know, he would have gone out with his own daughter if he'd been, what? Yes, thank you. Right. So
it's amazing to me that somebody like him can come on the public scene and be so brash, but again, that his political opponents are like seemingly scared to really call him what he is. I wonder what's going on there.
Well, I don't know the answer to what was going on, you know, inside Bernie's mind, inside Hillary Clinton's. I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, to be charitable, it could have been that racism is so with us, all of us, me, everybody, you know, that that's what they were thinking. I don't know, but it seems to me utterly clear with his employment policies and his, you know, I don't know. Well, why don't we ask them? Okay.
Do you have their numbers?
No.
Let's get them on Skype right now. Another question from the audience was about common cause and overcoming elitism. Do you want to talk a little bit about this idea of common cause and how people can, I mean, yeah, I guess the question is stated well as it is. I won't elaborate.
Okay. Well, I think the biggest argument against elitism is it's boring. I mean, you know, I don't think, I mean, I think probably people become the best allies when it's not only first and foremost, it should be empathy, and for empathy, actually, we do need to be together in this way. We need to be physically together. It turns out that oxytocin, the famous tend and befriend chemical that allows us to not just know, but to actually empathize and understand. I asked a neurologist friend of mine if that can be produced in, much as I love books, on the page or on the screen, and she said, no, actually, you have to be in each other's physical presence. And I think that's important, so the ways in which people get isolated from each other are really a big part of the problem. And I think that probably the so-called elite are most reliable, or speaking personally, when I think I became more of a reliable ally when I came home from India, where I lived for 2 years when I first got out of college. And then I became conscious that walking around in my neighborhood, I could have gone snowblind. There were so many white people. I mean, unlike, I thought, where is everybody? Right? And I got mad on my behalf. How dare somebody tell me who my friends are and where I can live and so on. So I think a combination of empathy and also anger on our own behalf. Have you ever looked at the elite? To be only with the elite is truly boring. I was on a plane with a woman I didn't know, was across the aisle, who was a venture capitalist, very successful, and she was going to speak at Harvard Business School. And we discovered that neither one of us had any respect for Harvard Business School on her part, because they're always fighting the last battle, and then they won a lot of money when they graduate and so on. So we decided we should teach a joint course called Money is Boring, which it is unless you use it for something creative. It is boring. Hello, it is boring. And then we were going to have a little sub-seminar called How Much is Enough? So I think some combination of empathy and enlightened self-interest will get us out of elitism pretty fast.
Ed, I've got another question from the audience. Ed Broadbent talked about this kind of younger generation of people in your country who are really, really excited and energized about politics. Many of them are young men, boys. Mm-hmm. So the question from the audience is, what would be your advice to teenage boys?
Watch out for testosterone poisoning. No, I shouldn't say it that way because it sounds immutable. I don't mean in that. I just mean watch out for the dehumanization that comes with the idea of masculinity. Because, it's as if the full circle of human qualities, there's 100% human qualities here. All right, arbitrarily, say 2/3 are called masculine, 1/3 are called feminine. It's true that women are more deprived, but it's also true that men are deprived too. Mm. So, what is it? And actually it happens to little boys sooner, say from 5 to 8, where it happens to girls maybe 10, 11, somewhere, that the gender roles come down on you as a prison. I would just try to say to them, you deserve to have your whole human self. You deserve to relate to all other human beings. Sometimes I think the world is divided into two kinds of people. Those who divide the world into two kinds of people, and those who don't. So I would urge them not to divide the world into two kinds of people, and then subsets of that.
I was writing all these notes furiously while you were talking. I had all these questions from before. I could sit up here for a long time, and we would both get into whole lots of trouble if I did. So I have to wrap up.
I'm up for it.
But I just want to thank you again for a lifetime of work and a lifetime of writing and agitating and inspiring. And it's been a great honor for me to be able to sit on this stage with you. Right. So thank you.
And wait. I want to thank you for giving me faith in the future. Thank you. We stay here or we go off?
Hi, I'm Michele Landsberg. Hey. Thank you. How are your oxytocin levels? Gloria said we have to be in close contact, personal contact, to get that zing. And I want to say what a pleasure it is to be in close contact with one of my older heroes and one of my newer heroes, Gloria and Desmond. Well, I'm your wrap-up artist here, so I won't be too long. Hang in. I just want to tell you I've known Gloria for many, many decades as a friend. And I think I can with some certainty say I have never, ever heard her use the word intersectionality. She doesn't say it, she lives it. And from the very beginning of the movement in which she played such a huge role, at a time when no one else was living it quite the same way, she blazed a trail. I met Gloria in the late 70s when she came to Toronto to speak at a fundraiser for abortion rights. And with her as a sister speaker was the wonderful Black lawyer Flo Kennedy. She mentioned Flo this morning, who was just mesmerizing on the podium and so funny. And I didn't know it then, but that was the way that Gloria moved in the world. Everywhere she went and everywhere she spoke, and as her most recent book documents, you should read it, she's been in alliance with other feminists of different colors and cultures long before anyone thought up that word intersectionality or told us to question our own white privilege. Gloria was doing it. So I think it's so fitting and so delightful that she's been paired on this platform with Desmond Cole, who's played such a significant role already in illuminating the struggle over police carding of young Black men, its stupidity, its dangers and its ugly injustice, and he's become an important voice in the media just as Black Lives Matter is blazing into prominence. So this Progress Summit comes at a vital moment. For several years, I personally have been frightened by the yawning inequality that is swallowing up younger generations in a sort of miasma of hopelessness. I've been frustrated and grieved by the wholesale injustice against Aboriginal peoples. And I, like you, have been terrified by our reckless rush toward climate disaster. But suddenly, movements for change are springing up all around us. Occupy alerted the world and created the understanding of the 1%. Idle no more, and the women demanding justice for the missing and murdered Indigenous women are finding resonance, finally, and in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And now we're finally going to have that inquiry that Harper denied for so long. Black Lives Matter is standing up against the murderous racism north and south of the border. And at this very moment is demonstrating in front of Toronto Police Headquarters. Yes! And the demand for electoral reform is so strong that even the liberals are promising action. And feminism, my own darling movement, in many guises, is bubbling up again and has pride of place in all these insurgent movements. So, my son, Avi Lewis, tells me that the smell of sweetgrass was perfuming the air at Black Lives Matter, when he was last there. And a group demonstrating under the banner "We Believe Survivors" had rushed over to join Black Lives Matter. The energy of all these resistance movements is rising and converging. We must not let the shrill, vindictive, slanging matches of the internet distract us from the greater positive force embodied in these movements. And I know how easy it is to get caught up in all that internet online viciousness, which is so crazy and so irrelevant. In view of all that's happening, we are actually having our North American spring. I wonder if Cairo is taking notice. So where is it all going? Will each movement have its moment of sunshine and then fade to darkness? I fret over this. Where, after all, can movements really change society, if not through government? There is this gulf. And how can they bridge the gulf between the purity and strength of their vision, of your vision, and the gray-faced pragmatism of political parties? Yeah, we have sunny days again on Parliament Hill. This whole country rose about a foot in the air. It was palpable. I'm sure you felt it as it heaved a gigantic sigh of relief when it shook off the dead decade of Harbourism. But although there have been many positive steps already under the Trudeau regime, but I'm not optimistic on the cataclysmic crises we face on the environment. Let me be painfully honest. There isn't another party to the left of Sunshine that does much better in that department. So there's no other way to make profound and lasting change than through government. And the best change is the change that comes from the bottom up. So how can this happen? In my view, as a lifelong New Democrat, the thrilling social movements from Occupy to BLM to Idle No More to electoral reform will be the life force of the New Democratic Party. But only if the party comes to the people. If New Democrats are on the front lines and in the kitchens as well as the back rooms with Black Lives Matter and Sisters in the Spirit, if they're there every day absorbing the principles and the passion and learning, if they're genuinely open to being taken over by this learning, then the world may actually change just in the nick of time. And I do believe that that's the only way. I'm not kidding myself. It won't be smooth and easy. There are huge gulfs of understanding among all the groups and enormous differences in methods and goals. There's turf, and where there's turf, there's hierarchy, and the determination, acknowledged or hidden, to hold on to power. And what we on the left have long since learned is that the smaller our slice of the pie, the more puny our share of power, the more viciously we'll fight each other to hold on to it. And I go back a long way, and I remember all those fights. But surely we've reached the 11th hour, the time when all people who are sincerely progressive must come together to save the earth and to save ourselves. We must. Take the example of the Leap Manifesto. You've all heard of it and maybe even read it, and you've seen that panoply of forces that were signatories to the Leap Manifesto in the name of saving the earth. They all came together, from the Aboriginal people to labor to the feminist movement. All of them were able to unite around this core issue. So we have to steel ourselves to bend more, to listen to each other, to link arms. I remember back in the day on one of those great days of action at Queen's Park, remember the Mike Harris days? When one of the more gnarled of the security guards, the legislative security guards, came down the stairs to whisper in my ear. I was among the demonstrators, and I thought he was going to threaten me. But instead, he grinned and whispered in my ear, "OBU, one big union, remember the Wobblies." Unbelievable. And in the light of that solidarity, let me say the time is ripe and the place is right. We can out Sanders Bernie right here in Canada. We can and we must. Thank you. Thank you.